It would seem, what kind of fate can you only dream of? Of course, to become a queen. You sit on your throne in luxury, your husband is a real king, and all you do is have fun. But was the life of the queens of the past really so easy and pleasant? Why were there almost no beautiful princes among them? Is it true that the royal kind is a public event? And how did the mother-in-law drive the Queen of the Austrian Empire crazy? Why did Queen Victoria sit on bread and tea as a child and couldn't see other people? And is it true that the Queen's profession is deadly dangerous? So, let's find out what the life of the queens of the past was really like. So, meet young Jane Grey. This is the Queen of England, who is not even mentioned in most history textbooks. She wasn't supposed to be a queen, she was fourth in line to the throne. Since childhood, she was most concerned about her own development and improvement. Jane lived at a time when, after the Reformation, aristocratic women finally had the opportunity to engage not only in the birth of children at home, but also in self-education. At this time, a whole galaxy of brilliant, highly educated ladies appeared. But our Jane Grey stood out strongly even against the background of these intellectuals. She learned Latin, Greek, French, and Italian as a child. Then she learned Spanish, ancient Babylonian, Hebrew, and Arabic. She was very friendly with King Strike 6, her age, the one from Mark Twain's book The Prince and the Beggar. And then, at 16, the young king died, and appointed her as his heir. When Lady Jane was announced that she was now the queen, the girl fainted. And not at all partly, but rather from horror. In order to become a queen, one had to either inherit the throne or marry the king. But what should be the one who has a chance to marry the king? Of course, first of all, an educated and well-mannered girl from a good, preferably royal family. In the Middle Ages, this often meant that she should be brought up not in the cozy rich house of her parents, but in a monastery. If you think that school and institute are hard, imagine a monastery. However, royal children were also taught at court. Thus, King Louis IX, for example, himself gave lessons to his daughter Isabella, Queen of Navarre. But all this is nothing compared to how the future Queen Victoria was trained in the 19th century. Yes, the very grandmother of all Europe, the name that gave the name of an entire epoch. She was brought up according to a very harsh Kensington system, specially created for poor Victoria. The mother and stepfather kept the princess in complete isolation. She was not allowed to communicate with strangers, was fed bread and milk and forbidden to eat pastries, because they believed that muffins, butter, and jam provoked the development of sensuality. Meat was also a rare delicacy. Little Princess Victoria swore as a child that when she grew up, she would eat meat every day, and she zealously fulfilled this oath all her life. New beautiful dresses came only out of necessity, when the old ones were worn to holes. Add to this a strict daily routine. Not a minute in idleness, not a minute without adult supervision, and at the same time not a single peer nearby. This was the childhood of the future queen. Before she ascended the British throne 18 years ago, Queen Victoria still continued to sleep in the same room with her mother. The queen hated this system of education all her life. So, congratulations. Education is in the past and you marry a handsome prince, who will then become no less a wonderful king. Well, you are the queen. That's just the reality of the prince, and kings were rarely handsome. Almost all royal families were related to each other by family ties. Naturally, this led to degeneration and genetic diseases. The ugliest king of the past, of course, was Charles II, the last representative of the Habsburg dynasty. His frightening appearance is the result of incestuous unions for 16 generations. His father was his mother's uncle. The poor king was an invalid. He began to walk independently by the age of 8. He could not articulate and chew food, and he was even married twice. The niece of the King of the Sun, Marie-Louise of Orleans, was lucky to marry the king for the first time. The feeble king fell madly in love with his wife, and she inspired him, no matter what, to do business in the country. However, the queen died without leaving an heir. He was forced to marry a second time, but this time he and his wife simply hated each other until the death of the poor king. And this is Charles VII, another of the ugliest monarchs. However, his wife Maria of Anjou is also difficult to call a beauty. They are considered the ugliest royal couple in history. Note also that the court painters diligently flattered their crown models. At the same time, the king also got himself a young mistress, the universally recognized beauty Agnes Sarah. She is also famous for the fact that she led the fashion to walk at court with one breast bare. The eldest son, tormented by the queen's jealousy, Louis XI, who became king after his father, was even scarier. So much so that he ordered his portraits to be painted only in profile. It is unlikely that his young bride Margaret of Scotland dreamed of such a groom, who was an exalted girl, soared in the clouds and adored poetry. Ludovic was not only ugly, but also down-to-earth and rude. He was annoyed by his wife's romantic nature. The poor girl died of pneumonia before she reached her 22nd birthday. These are the beautiful princes. Let's return to our young English intellectual, who is being forced to become a queen. It took time to convince Jane to accept the crown, which she did not seek at all, because she was absolutely satisfied with her own life as a well-born aristocrat. When she was finally persuaded, she stood up and told the assembled lords that if she was destined to reign, she asked God's blessing to rule the country for the glory of God and for the benefit of her people. For days after the death of Edward VI, Jane Grey Dudley was proclaimed Queen of England. You are finally the queen and have taken your place on the throne. Do you think it's time to exhale and enjoy life? No, it's time to think about your responsibilities. And if you think that this is entertainment and a chic appearance, so that those who are served fall down in delight and cannot take their eyes off you, then you are cruelly mistaken. Now your main duty. The speedy birth of an heir, and preferably none, given the infant mortality in those years. And here the queen had a much worse time than the commoners. After all, her birth, such, in general, an intimate process, in modern times turned into an epic show for all the courtiers, to see which 200 people got drunk. And, mind you, they did not shyly avert their eyes to the side, but closely watched the whole process from beginning to end. The first wife of the Sun King Louis XIV, Queen Maria Theresa, was a very modest and shy woman by nature. Imagine how she felt when she went into labor, and at that moment a whole crowd of courtiers crowded into her room. The condition of the woman in labor did not interest anyone at the same time. How scared she was, how much it hurt, and even with such a crowd. The fact is that the presence of a significant number of courtiers served as a guarantee that the royal child would not be replaced. For example, they will not slip a desired boy instead of a born girl. By the way, when this very Queen Maria Theresa was dying, her last words were, "Since I am the queen, I had only one happy day." Which one, she did not specify. When another French Queen Marie Antoinette gave birth in the 18th century, who later became a victim of the Great French Revolution, 200 people gathered to see it. When the head appeared, and the doctor shouted, "The queen is giving birth," hundreds of courtiers rushed into her darkened room with such force that the king even ordered the tapestries to be secured with strong cords so that they would not collapse on the head of the unfortunate woman in labor. And the people climbed on the furniture and stretched their necks so as not to miss the moment of birth. The poor queen just fainted from all this. The queen's private life was also clearly regulated by the rules. There was much more freedom in the life of a commoner. In the Middle Ages, it was the queens who were praised as a model of morality that all noble ladies should follow. The queen had no right to look a man in the face, unless it was her husband, the king, and even shoot her eyes around during the ceremonies, but was obliged to look only straight ahead and kindly greet everyone she met. The queen should not get involved in disputes and altercations in society, otherwise she will lose authority and will float depraved. But you would be especially surprised by the daily life of the kings and queens of the time of Charlemagne or, say, the English queens in the 14th century. It did not consist of luxurious balls and receptions in palaces, as in subsequent centuries, but rather resembled a circus tent roaming the cities. The king, the queen, their children from the age of 8, and many courtiers, knights, clerks and servants traveled through the royal lands, staying for 1 or 2 nights in castles, noble houses and monasteries. They toured the possessions to show their greatness to their subjects all over the country. In addition, the maintenance of a large retinue of the king was a very heavy burden on the inhabitants of the area where they stayed for a long time. So the queens traveled a lot. They traveled on horseback or in carriages piled with soft velvet pillows. However, this did not save from the shaking that is inevitable when driving on broken dirt roads. While, at a later time, the poor queens had to endure unbearable aromas and drafts, for example, of the brilliant Versailles. You will say, well, were there really no beautiful monarchs who also loved each other? There were also such stories. Edward III could not breathe enough on Philippa Genego, Louis the Lion adored the noble Blanca of Castile, and Henry Tudor fell in love with Elizabeth of York forever. But was simple family happiness available to the queens? The famous Empress Elizabeth, or Sisi at home, who was called the most beautiful queen of Europe, married for love. Yes, Emperor Franz Joseph was also madly in love with her. It would seem that here it is, a real fairy tale. But the happy life of a young couple in the palace was spoiled by an overbearing mother-in-law. The young queen had to coordinate all her actions and words with her, and she did not want to share the emperor's son with anyone. The beautiful Sisi literally found herself locked in a golden cage. The formidable mother-in-law disapproved of her dislike of conventions, forbade going to the shops, trips out of town, and her husband was busy with state affairs all the time and did not contradict his mother. As a result, the mother-in-law literally drove the queen crazy. She even took Sisi's children as soon as they were born. Persecuted by her mother-in-law, and Sisi sought refuge in her private apartments, and her health began to suffer. The beautiful empress suffered from loneliness and depression. Soon she was sent to Italy altogether, ostensibly for treatment. The queen's work became deadly for the wives of the English King Henry VIII Tudor. Bright, intelligent beauty and Boleyn went a long way to becoming the Queen of England. For her sake, the king even went to church reform to get a divorce from his first wife Catherine of Aragon. That's just the happiness of being the Queen of England did not bring her happiness. 3 years later, Anna was accused of treason to the king and beheaded. It seems the accusations were unfair. After all, 10 days after Anna's execution, Henry married her maid of honor Jane Seymour. She stayed as queen for only a year, gave birth to a son, Edward, and died of childbirth. By the way, this is the same Edward who will later leave the crown to our Jane Grey. Henry chose his next wife, Anna of Cleves, almost from a photograph, that is, from a portrait. Well, that's the trouble. It turned out that the artist greatly embellished the bride. The king still got married, but 6 months later the couple separated. The next owner of the coveted title of Queen of England was cousin and Boleyn and Catherine Howard. The king was already old and fat, weighed about 140 kilograms, but at the same time he fell in love with a young beauty. But she was also accused of treason and executed. And, in general, the girl can be understood. In marriage, she seems to have had a hard time. But what about our heroine, who became Queen of England against her will? The elder sister of the deceased King Mary Tudor did not intend to retreat and also proclaimed herself queen by right of succession. She gathered an army to go to London and take the captured throne by force, and received the support of the people. She was a fierce Catholic, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of King Henry VIII. When it became clear that Mary Tudor would still take her place on the throne, Jane Grey was betrayed by everyone: the Privy Council, the courtiers, her family. When Jane's father informed her that she was no longer the queen, the girl breathed a sigh of relief. She had been on the throne for only 9 days. Mary Tudor, who will go down in history as Mary the Bloody, the most hated ruler of Britain, first executed Jane Grey's young husband, and so that the tie of her camera could see it, and then ordered to cut off her own head. The 17-year-old queen, who became a victim of the Game of Thrones, was so calm and firm at this moment that the executioner, according to legend, asked her forgiveness for what he had to do. Jane said, "Good people, I came here to die." The plot against Her Majesty the Queen was a lawless affair, but it was not for my sake that it was committed. I didn't want that. In history, she remained known as the uncrowned Queen of 9 days. The reign of the Bloody City Hall lasted 5 years. All this time, London's prisons were so overcrowded that all the churches of the city had to be turned into a prison. And, unfortunately, we will never know what would have happened if 17-year-old Jane Grey had remained on the throne. One of the most intelligent women of her era, devoid of power.